This one is special to me. As with many kids that grew up around the same time I did, this was my first Final Fantasy game. My personal history is that I saw a friend playing Final Fantasy VIII at his house one day, and I was so amazed by the graphics and sounds, I asked it for my birthday. My mum, bless her, ended up getting me Final Fantasy VII instead, with a printed out guide she must have bought off someone online. It was very useful apart from the last section of the guide that was missing, meaning I couldn't figure out how to complete a major side quest. This was also probably the first game I played that had a proper story that I engaged with on an emotional level. There was a moment when I was playing it before school, and I got to that scene. Needless to say, I didn't want to go to school, I was very upset. But enough reminiscing, let's actually talk about the game. Final Fantasy VII is the first PS1 game, hot off the heels of Final Fantasy VI, even rocking a similar aesthetic of an industrial magical world. Gone is the pixel art of the SNES era, we're into the pre-rendered background territory now. And with amazing, at the time, F&B sequences. This giant leap helps convey the story in a much better way as it leaves a lot less to the imagination. Square got really good at using pixel art in their backgrounds, but nothing compares to some of the visual quality and variety on display in Final Fantasy VII, a feat that could only be achieved with this new technology. The only real drawback to the visuals here, as far as I'm concerned, is the character models. This is super early 3D in video games, and this was Square's first attempt at a 3D RPG. In the field, they seem to have gone with basically making 3D renders of how the sprites in the older games would look like. Basic shapes with chunky differentiating features and bold colours. In comparison, for fights, the characters are rendered in a lot more detail, with character models that more closely resemble the character art and FMV models. It's a real mishmash of art styles. There are mods to change out the character models that make the characters look more normally proportioned, but the backgrounds are drawn to compensate for the fact that the characters in the field take on a more abstract look, and so sometimes the scale is a bit wonky. This isn't an issue when you're already suspending your disbelief with the chibi models, but just looks plain awkward when they look more realistic. This brings me on to the version differences. For this playthrough, I played on the PC version with the enhanced background mod known as Remarco. It uses AI upscaling to sharpen up the visual presentation, and for the most part it looks amazing. However, I do have little niggles with it. Sometimes certain screens seem to have confused the AI, and so the background can look wrong or doesn't seem to connect parts in the way that they should. In other moments it can look straight up wrong. The most egregious example I saw was in front of the Honeybee Inn, which the AI seemed to interpret as a massive brown smudge for some reason. It was also a bit of a pain to install, although I think this has been simplified since I first installed all of this. There was also a translation mod that I installed for a bit called Biakos. However, I stopped using it and started again after a while, once I unlocked the cross// limit break for Cloud, which they'd renamed Curse/. I'm sure that may be a more accurate translation, but the overall impression I got from the mod was snobbery, like showing how they can do such a better job than this guy who did it originally in the mid-90s. For what it's worth, the normal translation works just fine. Honestly, my recommendation if you're playing for the first time is the new console versions on PS4, Xbox One and Switch. They have quality of life features and are the most accessible versions to boot. This same version is on the PC too with Game Pass. While the look of the game is obviously shockingly different compared to the old games, the same can't really be said for the gameplay at a basic level. You're still exploring dungeons and towns in a similar manner to before, but within a 3D environment. The transition is honestly pretty smooth, and credit to Square for nailing this aspect of the gameplay so thoroughly with their first attempt. To ensure that navigating the much more complex looking screens is a hassle-free process, the game includes an assist mode which adds a little pointer above your character's head and small arrows next to the doors and ladders. Navigating the world map is also just a logical next step from Final Fantasy VI, which was using a pseudo 3D rendering technique before, so now the world looks more detailed with a properly modelled 3D world. Progression through the world is also very similar to previous games in the series, free to explore in any direction you want, but progression typically being gated by vehicles or cave systems. The battle system is mostly unchanged too, however the 3D presentation with characters physically moving up to enemies to hit them, with the enemies reacting to said hits, gives the combat much more impact. The ATB system is still in effect here and is completely unchanged for the most part. ATB gauge fills, you pick an action from the list and boom, there you go, you've fought. The key differences this time around is materia and limit breaks. Every character has access to several limit breaks split into 4 levels. These are triggered when the limit break meter is filled from taking damage, which will cause the ATB gauge to fill up rapidly and replace the basic attack with an extremely flashy special move. These always feel nice to pull off because their damage outputs can be ridiculous. The other big mechanic that fits into the combat system is Materia. This works a lot like how Magicite worked for Final Fantasy VI, where equipping characters with Materia gives them access to said abilities associated with it. Materia earns AP during battle too, and slotted Materia will level up after enough of it is gained, which will either allow access to more powerful spells or will create a fresh copy of itself when it's mastered. When slotting Materia into weapons and armour, paying attention to where you slot them is worth consideration too. There is a blue enhancement type, which will modify the Materia it's linked to. So, for example, I like to slot Restoration in a double link with an all Materia, which means that in battle I can use cure spells on all my party members. Another example I was pretty proud of in the late game was finding one called Added Cut, which allows the character to follow up the linked command with an attack. So I linked it with Death Blow, which is a command which forces a critical attack but has a chance of missing. With these two Materia combined, I basically created a risk-free version of Death Blow, because if I missed I still got an attack in, which itself could be a critical. This is the strength of the system. It's pretty simple but has enough flexibility in it where you can make yourself feel smart with how you can play around with it. My only real issue with the battles in this game is the fact that it can take forever for some enemies to do their attack animations. Obviously this new and impressive presentation of the fights meant that they wanted to show off what they could do, but they sacrificed some of the flow of battles in the process, especially when using summons as well. Summons are awesome, they look impressive as heck, and do great damage too, but they take ages to use, some being up to and over a minute long. The dungeons of Final Fantasy VII are mostly pretty straightforward affairs. The complexity of a lot of them mostly just due to some of the visual busyness of them. There are often items hidden behind hard to spot nooks and crannies that you may be able to spot if you're observant enough. Not many have much in the way of puzzles or anything really. The most complex dungeon I found was the Temple of the Ancients. That was because finding a path through was intentionally confusing. A lot of what makes the dungeons unique is their visuals. The new level of fidelity certainly helps with this, and the monster variety really lends each place you visit a unique feel. It's always fun to see what crazy enemy designs you'll find as you explore a new place. The last dungeon is pretty cool though. It's a longer than average raid through the caves, but the gimmick here is that you only have one save point, but you can put it anywhere you like. Bosses in Final Fantasy VII are a visual treat. The new 3D modelling and camera movements mean their size can truly be imposing, and their attacks have even more impact than before. The first boss, just like the previous 3 games, is used to demonstrate the ATB system with a counter-attack state that should be waited out. There's a few bosses that have little combat gimmicks, such as splitting the party in two for the airbuster fight, or party members becoming imprisoned in a pyramid. This is used a couple of times and is new for the series, but one attack is enough to break it, so it's extremely easy to resolve. Otherwise, it's pretty standard fare, with a lot of bosses being a part of the story or fun to tackle obstacles. A defining feature for Final Fantasy VII is the vast array of minigames you play over the course of the game. Probably the most iconic ones are the squatting minigame, the bike chase sequence, and the snowboarding. They are almost all pretty simple, and while it's true they often break up the gameplay a bit, they honestly feel like wasted development for the most part. Like, how important for the game was it to implement a weird CPR minigame? Or the pretty awful submarine minigame? Snowboarding is functional, but I wouldn't call it a great time, and the bike chase feels paradoxically pretty cool and horrible at the same time. The main attraction here is the story, to be honest. The story starts out with ex-soldier mercenary Cloud joining a group of eco-terrorists known as Avalanche to help them blow up a Mako power station. The group's leader, Barrett, explains the Mako energy is the lifeblood of the planet, and the more the Shinra company use it to power their cities and make profit off it, the more the planet is dying. But don't worry, this definitely isn't political. Winks at camera. Wait, that's a stage direction, but I don't have a camera. The mission's a success, and everyone returns to Tifa's bar in the Sector 7 slums, one of the other major characters in the game. Tifa is Cloud's childhood friend, and she's the one who convinced him to join the fight for the planet. The pair remember times past, and eventually Cloud agrees to go to the next mission to blow up Sector 5 reactor. Although things don't go as smoothly from beginning to end, with Cloud eventually falling into the presence of Aerith in the church. Things escalate from there, with the fight against the greedy, corrupt Shinra electrical company escalating to planet-ending stakes. The story very much seems to be a critique of unmoderated capitalism, the beauty of nature, how terrifying technology can be, as well as being a very uplifting tale in places. For all the death and heartbreak in the story, the underlying themes involve the joys of life, how the people that may leave us in life are actually never really gone, as they'll still live on in spirit within the planet. The design of the world is made to accommodate for this, with the life stream being a system for the planet to recycle the spirits of the dead to form new life, and to allow the spirits of those gone to still form connections with those around them in some small ways. The 4 main characters, especially through Cloud and Aerith, really explore this part of the story. I can't say much more without spoilers, but Final Fantasy VII's story is definitely worth experiencing. It gets very convoluted by the end with several twists which it honestly earns very well. Before I get into spoilers though, the spoiler-free version of my take on the characters is Cloud, Tifa and Aerith get the best character development, with Cloud being the most fleshed out and likeable protagonist in the game so far, and Aerith being a fun character who is a love interest but isn't overly tropey, and has a lot of agency of her own within the story. Unfortunately, I can't say the same with most of the other characters. A couple of characters I almost actively despise, and the others have enjoyable small side plot areas that develop them a bit but then barely feel involved in the main story. Tifa and Barrett's relationship with Cloud takes the centre stage, with the rest of the cast mostly falling to the wayside within the main plot. Sephiroth is an interesting antagonist, although his nature is maybe needlessly convoluted, but the way the game shows why this guy is intimidating and something to fear is really effective, and the relation he has with Cloud is rather engaging. But I'm not going to say much more without spoilers. I highly recommend playing Final Fantasy VII, so would hate to spoil much of it for people. But bear in mind, I 100% recommend playing the original game before the remake, as the remake is almost more of a companion piece to the original game rather than a reimagining. Right, so the timestamp is on the screen for when the spoilers will end. Jump to it to avoid them. Here they come in 3, 2, 1. So for the story spoilers this time around, I just want to talk about the moments that stood out to me, good or bad, and quickly discuss them. I don't think there's a need for some sort of detailed plot synopsis. I love the Market Street section of the game. It's basically a combatless scavenging dungeon, and is used pretty much exclusively to develop Cloud and Aerith's friendship. There's plenty of humour to be found within the nooks and crannies. Don Corneo is a perfectly hateable slimeball, and the way the characters squeeze the info out of him has always been pretty iconic to me. Following this, the high drama of the plate falling on Sector 7 has always been and continues to be a great plot point to really understand the evilness of the Shinra. Following that, the entire section in the Shinra building is my favourite part of the Midgar section, built up really well over the previous 4 or 5 hours of gameplay, and finally taking the fight in feels really good from a narrative perspective. The slow burn of revealing Sephiroth and Jenova within the building is cool too. I love the creepy atmosphere when following the blood trail up to the President Shinra's office to find him killed with Sephiroth's sword. The fact that he is immediately succeeded by Rufus is really fantastic shorthand for how difficult it is to truly collapse Shinra, as even if you cut off the head, someone else will quickly fill that power void. And of course, to cap off Midgar, the whole escaping sequence is excellent. The way that Sephiroth's power is demonstrated in Cloud's flashback is really good show don't tell storytelling. He decimates everything you run across while Cloud can barely scratch him. It's a narrative technique that's pretty unique to video games in that it puts the player character in a state of relative powerlessness, as Sephiroth is uncontrollable in the battles here. This is used in a more traditional sense later on as well, where after getting past the swamp avoiding the Midgar Zolom, you run across a snake like the one you've just escaped from, impaled on a tree, the workings of Sephiroth. Really not a fan of the Fort Condor minigame though. It's a cool concept, but it's really not amazingly implemented. The strategy element is fine I suppose, but playing it just feels kinda janky. The movement of everything is glacial, even at max speed, and the menus to issue orders feels clunky. It's annoying that this game is required for the story towards the end, but you can completely ignore the tactics element and just let the enemy reach the hut, go out and kill the enemy commander yourself and get it done. Completely ignoring the minigame. I don't think the game is better for its inclusion is all I'm saying. The same goes for Chocobo Racing too, if I'm honest. I felt playing the racing just wasn't that fun for me, and I never touched it again after being forced to during the story. Aerith's death is sudden and shocking. As I said at the start of the video here, this is the bit I got to just before school as a kid. I wanted to kill Sephiroth so bad. I must have been miserable at school that day. The scene is fantastic, and still hits an emotional chord even today. Cloud is being manipulated into striking Aerith at first, and you can't do much about it. Every button press besides confirm just makes him struggle, and only his friends snap him out of it, but then just after that Sephiroth comes down and stabs her, with Aerith's theme striking up loud and tragic. The dialogue is great here. Cloud is truly heartbroken, and the fight against Jenova afterwards still has Aerith's theme playing. It's a little touch that really adds to the tragedy of the situation. The characters with you react to the death uniquely too. I had Tifa and Barrett with me. Tifa bends down and affectionately strokes her hair before running off in tears. Barrett is also visibly upset and gently touches Cloud's shoulder in empathy. It's excellent character work, and the loss the player feels for Aerith afterwards is also a testament to just how strong of a character she is. I do love how the game's story refuses to see this death as a heroic sacrifice though. Yes, she dies while activating Holy, but as Tifa says in a late game, after Cloud mentions she might have wanted to give her life for the planet. Really, I wonder. I don't think that was it. I don't think she wanted to die at all, but was planning on coming back all along. She always used to talk about the next time. She talked about the future more than any of us. What happened on that altar was a woman's life being cut short, not exchanging a life for the future. I really love how Cloud's psyche is explored throughout the game. It all sort of starts with his explanation of returning to Nibelheim, and Tifa seems rather quiet about it overall. It's revealed slowly with hints sprinkled throughout that he has never been the person he says he is in the flashback. Sephiroth/Jenova starts revealing this to him within the Northern Crater by showing those same scenes but with another character in Cloud's place. He tries to keep his cool, but eventually he's asked the wrong question. Thinking back to how he even came into being a soldier, and it's starting his meltdown. As that's information he doesn't have, he's imitating someone else, Zack. He's a failed experiment, Hojo says, an effort to replicate Sephiroth after he died. What really happened at Nibelheim 5 years prior is explored in my favourite scene in the game. Tifa and a practically comatose Cloud fall into the livestream together, and their minds sort of meld. Tifa explores through his psyche and gently helps Cloud through his trauma and denial. I think this is where Tifa's strength as a character shines. She's a very caring and supportive person, and it comes across fantastically here. Cloud is gently guided through the memories of 5 years ago again, this time revealing the truth. He was there, but not the hero he claimed to be. He was just a normal grunt along with the soldier first class Zack and Sephiroth. What's interesting though is that Zack wasn't the one who stopped Sephiroth, he got smacked silly. Cloud, a guy with no real special abilities, was the one to take him out. He gets impaled but still uses his strength to throw him into the livestream below the reactor. This is where he's taken in and experimented on, enhanced with Jenova's cells. Again, I cannot stress how great this sequence is. It's touching, emotional, and important to the story. It's a shame that I feel this bit gets heavily overlooked in favour of Aerith's death scene though. The characters of Final Fantasy VII are a bit of a mixed bag. Cloud, Tifa and Aerith make this game. Barret comes right after these three as a character. He grows closer to Cloud throughout the game and obviously sees him more of a friend and respects him more as the game goes, but he's not in the spotlight much after Coral and the Gold Saucer, aside from after the Ancient Temple where he tells Cloud to get a grip. There ain't no getting enough of this train we are on. Everyone else is comparatively shallow though. I hate Ketchi. And yes, it's pronounced Ketchi. It's a reference to a Gaelic fairy. Don't worry, I was pronouncing it Kate Sith until I learned this too. His sacrifice is shown very heroically, only to butt in with a new body at a bad time, and he never really recovers as a character. Most characters get one big moment but aren't really involved in the main story much. Sid would be the exception to this, but I find him a little uncomfortable. He's likeable for the most part, in that grumpy old dad kind of way, but he's obviously the aggressor in an abusive relationship with Shira. She seems gaslit to the point she accepts and believes the reason Sid's always angry at her. It's hard to watch at times. All the characters are likeable though, even if most feel a little undeveloped compared to the main 3 or 4. They're still fun to hang around with. Most of the small subplots are nice too. Again, it's just a shame they're not properly fleshed out in some cases. Sephiroth is a pretty iconic villain. Although there was that one time a while ago when he got beat out by General Ram in a greatest villains of all time poll competition on GameSpot. Regardless, when it comes to Final Fantasy villains, it's usually between him and Kefka. Sephiroth is pretty crucial to the plot of the game, central to a lot of the events that set the whole ordeal into motion. Although, when I mentioned his nature was a bit convoluted earlier in the review, this is what I mean. For most of the game, we're not actually chasing Sephiroth himself, we're chasing Jenova. Sephiroth has taken over the will of Jenova, who was an ancient form-shifting alien which wiped out the Cetra thousands of years ago. And when Sephiroth fell into the livestream with her head after Cloud skewered him, their minds melded and became one. His physical body is encased in materia in the Northern Crater, and this is why when Sephiroth is encountered throughout the game, the boss fight is with a part of Jenova, and also why you can manipulate those with Jenova's cells like Cloud. This whole aspect makes Sephiroth maybe a little convoluted as a villain. Even if it's true he did burn down Nibelheim himself 5 years prior, that was a result of a genuine character breakdown and the most compelling part of his character arc. It makes the stakes personal for Cloud though, and that's pretty great storytelling all told. This convolution is engaging to learn though, and also makes subsequent playthroughs a little more enjoyable as you notice little hints you probably overlooked before. That's it for spoilers. Welcome back to those who skipped ahead. Let's talk about the music a bit, eh? The PlayStation came with a much higher fidelity for music, and Nobuo Uematsu made sure to take advantage of that. The music of Final Fantasy VII has a clarity not quite heard previously. The score is iconic and for good reason. Highlights include the bombing mission, Tifa's theme. Fight on. Aerith theme. Cosmo Canyon. Under the Rotting Pizza. And the main theme of Final Fantasy VII. I would have put in the special music for some of the boss fights, including the final boss, but I honestly believe you should experience those for yourself, as they probably hit more in the moment than they do just on their own with no context. Obviously, they're still awesome, and if you want to hear a lot more, the album's on Spotify, or other places if you check hard enough, I guess. So, to conclude, where do I feel Final Fantasy VII places in the series so far? To do that, I'm going to quickly touch upon the legacy this game has. Allegedly, this game changed RPG games forever, especially the JRPG subcategory. Now, that's a little interesting, isn't it? Because I said a bit earlier in the video here that the gameplay outside of how you view the action is largely unchanged from previous games, and that the gameplay is more refinement over anything radically new. And that there is the true legacy of Final Fantasy VII. It's not a revolutionary game due to its gameplay, but rather its presentation. In 1997, games just didn't look like Final Fantasy VII did, especially with how much the F&V sequences were used to market the game, putting the best of its graphics forward. So its legacy is that it brought the JRPG genre to the mainstream, and it set the standard for everything that came afterwards. Compared to the previous games, I think the only one that gives it a run for its money is Final Fantasy VI, and honestly I think 6 just about beats 7. I feel 6 is more consistent overall, the characters are almost universally great, and the story is simpler but in a way that feels to the game's benefit as to allow the characters more time to breathe. In comparison to 6, I'll describe Final Fantasy VII as having higher highs but lower lows, with a lot of feature creep with minigames bloating up the game a bit, and a higher percentage of the cast being a bit lacking in comparison to the rest. So my list so far is as follows. 1 Final Fantasy 6, 2 Final Fantasy 7, 3 Final Fantasy 5, 4 Final Fantasy 4, 5 Final Fantasy 1, 6 Final Fantasy 3, and 7 Final Fantasy 2. Thanks for watching. Next time I'll be discussing Final Fantasy 8, which is an interesting game to say the least. As always, likes, comments, and subscribing are always welcome gestures, and I'll see you next time.